It's always a privilege to be here at Christ in St. Luke's. This is now my fourth or fifth year to have this privilege, and I always learn so much from my visits here. Just this morning, I believe that I found a solution to a problem that our synagogue has and many other synagogues and many churches have. And that problem is that the sanctuary is too large for the smaller assemblages that we sometimes have. People feel so few and lost. You know, if you have 20 people in a room that seats 600. On the other hand, we often have services where the congregation is more numerous than our chapel room can hold. So what I've noticed we do here at Christ in St. Luke's for the early service is we use the side section of the sanctuary and pretty much fill it. And so you have both the intimacy of being close to your neighbor and the majesty of being in this glorious space. So I'm going to recommend that to the leadership of my congregation, that we consider using the side aisles of our main sanctuary for those kinds of chapel services where we don't quite fit. But who knows if they'll agree. Friends, I'd like to tell you a story about one of the great rabbis of Norfolk. He passed away just 10 years ago, and I still miss him. His name was Rabbi Sam Sobel. Rabbi Sobel was a decorated Navy veteran. I see some of you are shaking your heads. You knew him. He was the chaplain who inaugurated the Jewish Commodore Uriah Phillips Levy Chapel at the Norfolk Naval Station. He was the rabbi to every congregation in town when it was in between rabbis, or if its rabbi took ill. He was the man to help each of us go through our own moments of crisis. He had 3 daughters, and I know them all. One of them told me that she asked him the question, which is an unfair question to be sure, "Who is your favorite daughter?" His answer was typical of the man, modest, disarming, and just hinting at the deeper issues that you are invited to ponder. He turned to each girl in turn and would say, "You are my favorite oldest daughter. You are my favorite middle daughter. And you are my favorite youngest daughter." Those of you who have several children, learn. And I'll come back to that before the end of my remarks. Rabbi Sobel's answer comes to my mind when I think about the famous passage that was part of our first scriptural lesson this morning. At Mount Sinai, God asks the children of Israel to accept the covenant being offered and offers them a statement of chosenness. "If ye will hearken unto my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be mine own treasure from among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and ye shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This is the basic text of what is often called the doctrine of the chosen people. It's a doctrine which has been misunderstood. It's a doctrine which has been a proof text for people of a chauvinistic spirit and a jingoistic spirit. We're chosen, nanny poo poo, you're not. And in our postmodern and liberal age, people often reject monotheism because they reject a fundamentalist understanding of that text. Now, there is some justice to the charge that monotheism has often fostered religious intolerance. Think crusade. Think jihad. In Christendom, 1,000 years ago, medieval knights slaughtered Slavic pagans and dragged Jews to the baptismal font at sword's point. In the house of Islam, Arab armies ascendant over Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians forced their subjects into humiliating second-class service. And Muslim mobs rioted whenever an infidel, quote-unquote infidel, rose too high in government service. Truly, the bearers of monotheism have all too often coupled their belief in one God with a theology that the divinely sanctioned right order of the world puts them on top. How convenient. And the same God-granted, guaranteed order places all others either in the back of the bus or not in the bus at all. This is sadly still evident in the malevolent and murderous mockery of monotheism practiced by ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like. But God forbid, and I mean that literally, God forbid that we reject monotheism on the account of the chauvinism of people, flawed people, who synthesize monotheism with their own prejudice and their own xenophobia. Monotheism has been a channel by which people who hate have expressed their hatred. But other people who are not monotheistic, who do hate, express that hatred in different ways. The hatred is the common denominator, not the theology. Hitler worshipped only his own power. Stalin was an atheist. The Roman Empire, while relatively tolerant of other people's religions, was aggressive in the extreme, essentially inventing the concept of manifest destiny. They were destined to rule the world. Too bad for the rest of you. So our task is to re-examine our religion. I would say re-examine our Judaism. In this sacred space, I would say re-examine our Christianity, so as to affirm our understanding of the one God while decoupling it from the arrogant sense that the finite humans of my particular faith community have a God-given right to lord it over everyone who believes differently. Let me share with you at least the signposts of the way in which I understand monotheism. How should it be understood? In a way that leads to tolerance and not intolerance. The first point is to connect the concept of one God with one human family. In the study session just completed a few minutes ago, elsewhere in the church, we explored how the Bible begins with the insight that God is above nature. If there's one God for all the universe, then there's one God for all of humanity. Powerful teaching of the Bible. Every human, no exceptions, is created in God's image. The rabbis, commenting on this part of the Bible, bring that theme out explicitly. The rabbis ask, why does the Bible, which does not, after all, include everything from ancient history or from the history of Israel, why does the Bible include the story of Adam and Eve? Already to pose that question is liberating. It makes us realize that the Bible has an editorial process at work. And we want to plumb that process. And the rabbi's answer is that the Bible wants to teach you that no one may legitimately say, my blood is redder than yours. Because all of us come from the same first parents. All people are God's creation. All people share God's image. All people are blessed by God's love. What does that mean for us? It means that we need to treat each other as siblings, as brethren. You don't enslave a brother just because he fails to match an insight that you have. You don't force a sister to sit in the back of the bus just because her history has diverged from yours. Now, doesn't the Bible, in fact, say many harsh things about paganism? Rabbi, are you guilty of just cherry-picking the Bible here? The Bible does have harsh things to say about paganism, but not because being a pagan per se puts anyone beyond the horizon of human compassion. When you go home, open up to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 19. Lest thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, thou be drawn away and worship them, and serve them which the Lord thy God hath allotted unto all the peoples under the whole heaven. God is okay with pagans being pagans. I'll bet they didn't teach you that in Sunday school. You're not supposed to worship many gods. But the issue isn't theology, the issue is behavior. Canaanites practicing child sacrifice. Egyptians deifying the cruelty of a slave-owning society. That's what inspired Moses to speak as he did of the distinctiveness of Israel. So, if God loves all people, what makes the children of Israel the chosen people? And the answer is history. A history of enslavement. A history of degradation that had to be endured. Now, it's not that chosenness is some sort of payback for this. It's that enslavement allowed the newly freed slaves to understand that there is a better way to construct human societies. Chosenness means an insight that would ultimately benefit all people was first granted to them, and then to others. When my kids were little, and I would give them presents, oftentimes the rule was, you get to play with this present by yourself for a day, and starting tomorrow you share it with your brother. So people do get gifts, and they have a limited solo enjoyment of those gifts, but eventually we're supposed to share our gifts with each other. And now we can understand something more about the specific verbiage of the Bible. If I asked you to describe to someone who'd never been to this community what is a priest, you would have a very clear description. But it would be a description based on 2,000 years of Christian history. Is that what the word priest means in Exodus 19? You will be a kingdom of priests? Right? Did Moses refer to someone who has a cell phone? And has all the congregants on the address book there? No. Who were the priests that Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai would have known? not Jewish priests. Aaron, the first high priest, hadn't been consecrated yet. There were no Jewish priests when God said the word kingdom of priests. Who are these priests? If you can answer that, you'll understand what chosen people is all about. These priests were Egyptian priests. They're the only priests the Israelites had ever seen. And what's so special about Egyptian priests? Well, the book of Genesis tells you. Remember the 7 fat years and the 7 lean years? 7 years of famine? So in the story in Genesis, the 7 lean years come. Joseph has invented the grain silo. The Egyptian government owns years and years worth of extra government surplus grain. But unlike the American government, it doesn't make peanut butter available for free. The Egyptian government sold the grain to its own starving people. You want to stay alive? Sell us your livestock. Okay, that worked for 1 year. You want to stay alive? Sell us your land. That worked for the 2nd year. 5 years to go, 7 years of famine. In the 3rd year, the Egyptians came back to the government and said, we have nothing left to sell except our freedom. And so all of the Egyptians became slaves to Pharaoh, with one big exception. And by the way, that's why the Hebrew of the 10 Commandments is slightly but crucially different from the standard English translation. And I'm sure you are familiar with the translation. I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Familiar with that? House of bondage. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, Asher hotzaiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mi beit avadim. Beit avadim, house of slaves. Not Beit avdut, house of bondage, but Beit avadim, house of slaves. God is telling the Israelites, you have been freed from a country where you were slaves to slaves. They themselves were slaves to Pharaoh, and you were slaves to them. That's how cruelly hierarchical that society was. Who was not a slave in Egypt? Only one group, the priests. If you go back to the story in Genesis, it says all the Egyptians became slaves to Pharaoh except the Egyptian priests, because they had their daily bread from the government. This is the first instance in history of corporate welfare. Think about it. Right? So if you were an Egyptian priest 3,250 years ago, you were a free person. Moreover, you were the only free person that other people knew to be free. Now let's go back to Mount Sinai. God says to the Israelites, accept this covenant and you will be a kingdom of priests. That means accept this covenant and we will create a society where everyone is free. It's never happened. It's going to happen if you accept this covenant. Chosenness means chosen to be part of the experiment to create a society where everyone is free. In 1776, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The promise of Mount Sinai, moving one step forward. It's not done yet. There are people who are not free even today. So the message of Mount Sinai still needs to be fulfilled, but the fact that it is possible is known because it did at least come into the world then. So now, we can understand the Bible's statement that Israelites are God's particular treasure without being derogatory to the other nations of the world. Indeed, just as people are not clones, so have different nations enriched our common humanity by means of their diverse accomplishments. The classical Greeks gave all of us the ideas of democracy, of philosophy, of naturalistic art. The classical Chinese gave all of us a sensitive understanding of the relationship of individual and society. We can learn compassion for all living creatures from Hindu thought. We can learn tenderness for the brokenness of reality from Buddhist thought. We can learn of the beautiful and equal importance of women and men from Wiccans. Of course, all peoples find ways of expressing these values, but we can be thankful for those branches of our human family who first shared an insight with all others. And biblical Israel pioneered the realization that monotheism ought to mean the ethical refashioning of human society. So each daughter is the most special one. The oldest daughter is chosen to teach adults how to become parents. The second daughter is chosen to teach her older sister how not to be a spoiled only child. The youngest daughter is chosen to round out the family. If any of you have 4 kids, figure out how to go from here. Each of us is chosen, but the responsibility remains ours to make that a choosing for good. Israel's historic glory is that it was chosen to be the vehicle to teach all people how to be one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. Amen.